Hi, welcome. My name is Magdalena Duškové, and I'm going to be moderating this panel and the questions that are going to come afterwards. Today we're going to focus on the liberation and or second occupation debate, which is happening in Central and Eastern Europe when it comes to the Red Army and the end of Second World War. We have three amazing speakers here who are going to present their research, and then we're going to have questions afterwards. First, I would like to welcome here online on Zoom, you can see her here, Borbala Klascmann, who is a Hungarian Holocaust historian. She completed her doctoral studies at the Department of History at the University of Szeged. Her areas of expertise include the microhistory of Hungarian Holocaust and the restitution and compensation of Holocaust survivors. Previously, she worked for the Holocaust Memorial Center in Budapest, the Anne Frank House, and the Yad Vashem archives. She has organized several international conferences, and her popularizing and scientific articles have been published in 3 languages. Currently, she is a Sol Kagan postdoctoral fellow at Osvobození University and the editorial assistant of Eastern European Holocaust Studies. Okay, the second person we have invited today is Jaromír Mrňka, sitting here in Prague, in his physical body. He has studied history at the Faculty of Arts at Charles University. He has long been engaged in the study of informant culture and collective violence and sexual violence in the Czech lands during the World War II and after its end. His book Limity lidskosti, The Limits of Humanity, depicts the Czech land at the end of Second World War as a space of uncontrollable collective violence. He currently serves as the head of the Prague branch of the German Historical Institute in Warsaw and teaches at the Faculty of Humanities at Charles University. And our third guest, who is on Zoom, is Justina Smalkyte. Smalkyte. I'm so sorry. I'm maybe messing it up a little bit. Justina is a scholar of the Holocaust, mass violence, and Central Eastern European studies. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the German Historical Institute in Warsaw and an affiliated researcher to the Center for History at Sciences Po Paris. She holds a PhD in history from the Sciences Po. Her research draws on methodologies and approaches from material culture studies, historical anthropology, the history of the body, and gender history. She recently co-edited a special issue titled Gender and Materiality in Central and Eastern Europe in the 20th Century, published in the journal Konec, exploring post-communist spaces. Welcome, Justina.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this introduction.
Okay, I think now we can go to the first presentation of Borbala, if you may start.
Okay, and I'm sorry for the confusion.
No worries.
So,
perfect.
I made the PowerPoint only to illustrate what I'm talking about because there are a lot of monuments, etc., involved in this, and I thought that it would be very beneficial for the public to see them. So I made the title to this short presentation, The War's End, the Second Hungarian Republic and Their Place in Memory Politics. And as you already know, this is a very debated period, both among historians and in public discussion. And its assessment is also influenced by memory politics, especially in the last 1 or 2 decades. So I will briefly talk about the history of the end of the Second World War and the post-war years, because I'm pretty sure that not everyone is familiar with this in the Hungarian context. So the German occupation of Hungary happened on the 19th of March in 1944, but this was a very weird occupation because Hungary had been an ally of Germany ever since the beginning of the war. Hitler only wanted to prevent Hungary's negotiations and armistice with the Allied powers. There was no considerable resistance against the occupying forces. And this is Regent Miklós Horthy, who led the country from 1920 until 1944. He remained in office. And there's a picture of the German occupation. Horthy had the power to act independently even after the occupation, although it was somewhat limited. For instance, he appointed his own candidate, Dömez-Tójai, as the prime minister. Contrary to the German will, the Germans wanted Béla Imrédi, who was a famous rightist politician. Horthy was also able to stop the deportations, which started after the German occupation, and he was able to dismiss Tójai and appoint Géza Lakatos as prime minister in August. Additionally, it is also important to emphasize that all of the foreign states which had diplomatic relations with Hungary continued to recognize Hungary as a separate state with its own government. Now, Horthy arranged an armistice with the Soviet Union and announced it over the radio on the 15th of October, but the Germans already knew about this and they kidnapped his son and forced him to resign. And instead, they helped the Aerocross Party to form a government. And the Aerocross Party was an extreme rightist, anti-Semitic party who continued the war and the persecution of the Jews even after this event. Now, the Red Army crossed the border of Hungary in September 1944, and the siege of Budapest started in December. There are several recollections about the bombings at Christmas, for instance, and the Red Army basically had to advance from building to building. The siege lasted for 2 months, which was actually, as I got to know while preparing for this presentation, was the longest successful siege of any city during the Second World War. But basically the whole city was destroyed in the meantime, and all of the Danube bridges were blown up by the Germans who wanted to stop the Red Army. At the same time, the Soviet soldiers also committed crimes. They raped approximately 100,000 women. They stole private property, deported around 100,000 men and women to the Soviet Union for forced labor, which was called Malenkaya Rabota. This is what they told the people, that they will go for a little work, and in Hungarian language or popular language, it became Malenki robots, which is a distortion of the Russian original. And even Holocaust survivors fell victim to these atrocities. Even during the war, at the end of 1944, military officer Béla Miklós met with the exiled communists in Moscow and agreed on forming a government. And this was the Provisional National Government, which was established on the 22nd of December 1944 in Debrecen. And the so-called democratic parties were members of this government, among them the Hungarian Communist Party, the National Peasant Party, the Hungarian Social Democratic Party, the Independent Smallholders Party, and the Civic Democratic Party. They also formed the Hungarian National Independence Front in December 1944. The Provisional National Government then signed the armistice with the Soviet Union, and they started structural reforms in the country and the reformation after the war. This included also post-war transitional justice, for instance, the people's tribunals. However, even though Hungary was occupied by the Red Army, due to the pressure of the Western Allied forces, for a while, the country still operated as a pluralist democracy. The first general elections with universal franchise were held in November 1945, and the Smallholders Party, which was actually a rightist peasant party, won at these elections, the communists received only 17% of the votes. The Soviet commander, Marshal Voroshilov, allowed only the coalition of this party and the three leftist parties, the Communists, the Social Democrats, and the National Present Party, to form a new government. In February 1946, Hungary was declared a republic, and the president became Zoltán Tildy, who was the leader of the smallholder party. The communist influence at the same time started to grow as Mátyás Rákosi became the deputy prime minister, and László Rajk, both of them were prominent members of the Communist Party, became the Minister of the Interior. During the following years, the Communist Party obtained increasing power with the support of the Soviet Union, and they arrested or expelled the key figures of the Smallholders Party. In August 1947, there was a new election held, and the communists committed an election fraud. This was the so-called blue ballot elections, and even like this, they got only 24% of the votes. In June 1948, the Social Democratic Party merged with the Communists, and they created the Hungarian Working People's Party. And after that, a one-party state and the communist dictatorship started, whose final step was a new constitution modeled after the Soviet Union's in 1949, and this dictatorship was led by Mátyás Rákosi. According to consensus today among historians, this period between 1945 and 48 is called the Second Hungarian Republic. And now I will turn to the historical interpretations of this period. I think it's quite obvious that during socialist times, there was an anti-fascist narrative frame and the absolution from war crimes and crimes against humanity, including the Holocaust. The topics of collaboration, responsibility for the Holocaust were entirely silenced. The Horthy period was called reactionary, and even the suspicion of someone sympathizing with it could result in punishment. The Soviet Red Army was labeled as a liberating force, and monuments were erected in honor of the Red Army. You can see one of them, which is in the heart of Budapest in this slide. Obviously, the atrocities committed by the Red Army were obscured and not talked about. The interpretation changed after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the socialist regime, when archives opened up and historical research into the events became more nuanced, and Western research trends also appeared in Hungary. And the assessment of these events changed radically, and there was a proliferation of various interpretations of this period. Even the name of the end of the war is debated even today. Is it a liberation or is it an occupation by the Red Army? Which is obviously the interpretation is based on the interpreter's point of view, because for the Jews and the persecuted leftists, it was liberation. For the majority of the population, it was occupation. There are attempts at synthesizing these views. For instance, megszabadulás, which means release from the German occupation. But this term does not imply liberation, and it is not really widespread. So these are just attempts at trying to reconcile the two opposing views. After the decades of oppression, there was a strong nationalism bursting after the end of socialism, and this appears also in the public discourse and the interpretations of the recent past. And there are very strong competing narratives, which also result in competitive victimhood, of course. And these differing narratives are also embraced by various political parties, and they influence several things. For instance, the compensation of victims, both for the victims of Holocaust and the socialist era, cultural institutions such as museums and so on, and memory politics manifesting in monuments and commemorations. There is also an attempt at exploiting this post-war era by enforcing a certain interpretation in order to achieve political agenda. And I will talk about our current government's interpretation, which has been enforced in the past 15 years already. And they are trying to create a kind of national community through this interpretation. So this is a nationalist interpretation, of course, and it says that the whole nation was suffering from the German occupation. Everyone was a victim of the German occupation, and immediately after the German occupation and the Soviet occupation started, so this interpretation absolves the nation from the crimes committed during the Holocaust, the widespread collaboration with both the Germans and the Soviets. And the ways this narrative is enforced, I brought only three very famous examples. The first one is the House of Terror, which was established in 2002 during the first Orban government. And it introduces the two so-called terror regimes. However, the exhibition entirely downplays the Aerocross era. There are only 2 rooms dedicated to it in a 3-story building. You can see it here in the picture. And it talks mostly about the communist period. The museum does not speak about collaboration or the Horthy era, and the Holocaust is associated merely with the Aerocross party and the Germans. The second one is the monument for the victims of the German occupation, which was unveiled in 2014, the Holocaust Memorial Year. And this monument basically depicts Hungary as Archangel Gabriel, which is attacked by the Nazi eagle, and it symbolizes that the whole nation is innocent and again obscures the Holocaust and Jewish suffering and the collaboration of Hungarian elite and basically many people among Hungarians. What you have to know about this statue is that there was a huge resistance against it by the Jewish communities, and there were protests going on for 2 months because this is also in the same square where you can see the Soviet monument. There were protests going on for 2 months, 2 or 3 months, I can't even remember, I was there for a long time too. And therefore, the Orban government did not want to inaugurate this statue. They just put it there in the middle of the night, and the next day it was there. And the third one is our new constitution, created in 2011. In Hungarian, it is called Alaptörvény or Fundamental Law. And I quote from this: "We count the recovery of our country's sovereignty lost on 19th March 1944 from 2nd of May 1990, the establishment of the first freely elected parliament." So this phrasing explicitly denies the existence of the Second Hungarian Republic and pushes responsibility on the occupying forces, and through that it's supposed to strengthen nationalist feelings. And the Orban government found its legitimacy in the Horthy era, and by depicting basically half of the 20th century as a continuous dictatorship, the period between 1920 and 1944, when Horthy was Hungary's regent, becomes the only time when Hungary can be considered a fully sovereign and thus autonomous country. And the fact that Hungarian Jews were persecuted almost throughout this period is neglected and silenced, of course. Today there are still several interpretations existing simultaneously. The government enforces this nationalist view, and this is probably the most prominent in common discourse. But at the same time, there are academic circles where research is done on this period, and many historians emphasize the need for a more nuanced depiction of the end of the war and the post-war years. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Now we will hear Jaromír and his presentation.
Tak dobré odpoledne. Já jsem teda využil drze šance mluvit v češtině a nechávat se pohodlně překládat do angličtiny. Já když jsem uvažoval o tom, jak ten příspěvek mám koncipovat, tak protože jsem o tomhle tématu už hovořil hodněkrát a nechtěl jsem se úplně omezovat na ten text, který jsem psal pro Alarm a pro tu jejich řadu, tak jsem připravil takovou trošku kondenzovanější verzi toho, co si myslím, že z mojí dosavadní vědecké práce je tak nějakým způsobem jako podstatný pro tohleto téma. Já bych se chtěl zaměřit na českou zkušenost konce druhé světové války a na roli Rudé armády. V posledních letech se taky v české veřejné debatě stále častěji objevuje výklad, podle něhož tedy květen 1945 nepřinesl nebo neměl přinést skutečné osvobození, nýbrž druhou okupaci, tentokrát tedy sovětskou. V tomto pojetí Rudá armáda nevystupuje jako síla, která ukončila nacistickou válku a vládu a nadvládu, ale jako jakýsi nástroj moci, která měla následně podřídit Československo Moskvě. Taková interpretace podle mého názoru stojí spíš na nějakých pozdějších zkušenostech, které se promítají zpětně do května 1945. Stojí na zkušenosti srpna 1968, případně na dnešní zkušenosti války na Ukrajině a neodrážejí skutečný průběh událostí roku 1945. Z dobové perspektivy byla Rudá armáda chápána především jako osvoboditelka, ukončila nacistické násilí, zlikvidovala zbytky německé branné moci a správy a umožnila plnou obnovu československého státu. Na rozdíl od Polska, Maďarska či Rumunska zde u nás po válce nevznikla sovětská vojenská správa a české úřady nebyly nějakým způsobem zasaženy nebo rozpuštěny. Což taky nějakým způsobem navazuje na specifikum té předchozí protektorátní správy, která byla víceméně do značné míry hodně samostatná. Už v průběhu května 1945 fungovaly národní výbory, povstalecké jednotky, revoluční gardy, které v mnoha regionech a v mnoha případech převzaly kontrolu nad situací mnohem dříve, než dorazily sovětské oddíly. Rudá armáda tedy do značné míry vstupovala do prostoru, který se spravoval sám, který byl samosprávný, a nikoliv tedy do země, kterou by bylo třeba nějakým způsobem obsadit. Jsem říkal, že budu zapomínat posunovat slajdy a to je vždycky můj problém. Je nepochybné, že na druhou stranu Sověti samozřejmě prosazovali na našem území svoje vlastní zájmy, ať už to byly zájmy vojenské, hospodářské nebo politické. Bezprostředně po skončení bojů zde například působily jednotky vojenské kontrarozvědky Smerš, které zde zatýkaly sovětské emigranty, válečné zajatce nebo dezertéry. Docházelo samozřejmě i k zabíjení jednotlivců, i k masovým popravám. Tyto zásahy byly do značné míry velmi tvrdé, často z české strany nepochopitelné, ale vycházely víceméně z logiky tehdejšího sovětského státu, jenž nadále měl prioritu v likvidování vnitřních nepřátel. V jiných ohledech naopak Rudá armáda sehrávala roli stabilizační. Z dokladů v pramenech lze vysledovat, že sovětští velitelé v některých regionech, zejména třeba na Moravě, vydávali příkazy k zastavení poprav a k omezování samovolné činnosti revolučních gard a dalších paramilitárních jednotek. Zasahovali proti neregulérním exekucím a spontánním lynčům na Němcích, které se rozhořely zejména v prvních dnech po skončení války. Na druhé straně lze vysledovat a lze to dokonce i kvantifikovat, že za většinu poválečných excesů nesly zodpovědnost české ozbrojené složky, ať už to byly revoluční gardy, později jednotky Sboru národní bezpečnosti, různé partizánské oddíly nebo místní národní výbory. Násilí, které se rozvinulo po druhé světové válce v našem prostoru, mělo víceméně domácí charakter a nebylo žádným způsobem řízeno z Moskvy. Tento poměr se dost jasně odráží i v některých konkrétních událostech, například v improvizovaném internačním táboře na Strahově, který byl zřízen krátce po osvobození, který byl tedy zpočátku pod sovětskou správou. Tam se vojáci dopouštěli do značné míry znásilňování a dalších násilných činů. Ovšem i po převzetí toho areálu pod českou správu tam byli sovětští vojáci nadále záměrně vpouštěni. Sovětské velitelství o těchto případech do značné míry vědělo, ale jejich řešení přenechávalo českým úřadům. Je také nutno poznamenat, že po převzetí správy českými úřady se podmínky internovaných nezlepšovaly. Strahov se tak může do značné míry stát symbolem nějaké sdílené odpovědnosti, české tolerance vůči násilí a sovětské nezodpovědnosti nebo beztrestnosti, které společně vytvářejí prostor pro rozvoj tady tohodle druhu násilí. A je to samozřejmě jen jeden příklad z mnoha. Jinou podobu měl vývoj například v Postoloprtech a v Žatci, kde tedy koncem května 1945 začaly působit československé jednotky. V tom prostoru se objevovaly i revoluční gardy, působili tam i sovětští vojáci a samozřejmě se zde ustavila i místní revoluční správa v podobě místních národních výborů. Čeští velitelé, kteří tam byli nasazeni, dostali rozkaz vyčistit ten prostor od německých nepřátel. V následujících dnech došlo k rozsáhlým hromadným popravám, při nichž zahynuly stovky místních Němců. Sovětské velení tady do těch událostí vůbec nezasahovalo. Nešlo však v tomhletom případě o nějakou spoluúčast, nejbrž spíš o výraz toho, že Československo samo obnovovalo kontrolu nad svým územím, byť prostřednictvím výrazně excesivního násilí. Násilí zde nebylo už výrazem nějakého bezvládí nebo nějakého mocenského váku, ale naopak nástrojem formující se státní moci. Podobná dynamika se potom odráží i v mostecké oblasti, zejména v táborech, které byly v okolí záluží u mostu, které byly napojené teda na hydrogenační závody. Původně se jednalo o zařízení, která byly spjaté s obnovou těch hydrogenačních závodů a které měly pro Sověty strategický význam. Po příchodu těch sovětských jednotek oni tedy převzali kontrolu nad tímhletím zařízením. Docházelo zde k velmi excesivnímu bytí, znásilňování, rozsáhlým úmrtím. Sovětští důstojníci a sovětské jednotky usilovali zejména o zajištění pracovních sil. České složky na druhé straně chtěly obnovit kontrolu a chtěly zajistit nebo vytvořit nějaký prostor pro umístění vězňů. To rozsáhlé týrání a úmrtí těch internovaných pokračovalo, jen výrazně vlastně nějakým způsobem měnilo svůj účel. Místo likvidace šlo o využívání práce. V této souvislosti je vlastně docela zajímavý poznamenat, že ty tábory v záluží u mostu původně sloužily jako místa nacistické nucené práce, kde byly do značné míry vlastně využívání váleční zajatci a tam víceméně se vytváří jakási kontinuita tady využívání tady tohoto prostoru. Záluží tak můžeme i v té poválečné době potom vnímat jako jakousi laboratoř poválečné spolupráce, jako místo, kde česká a sovětská moc nacházely nějaký společný zájem na disciplinaci poražených. Ani pochod z Brna do Pohořelic, to takzvané eufemistické vyvedení Němců z Brna, nelze chápat jako sovětskou operaci. Opět se jedná víceméně o akci českých samosprávných orgánů, které se rozhodly řešit osud německého obyvatelstva ve městě a řešit z jejich pohledu se zhoršující bezpečnostní situaci. Rudá armáda v té oblasti byla přítomná, ale opět víceméně nezasahuje. Její pasivita sice znamenala nějaký tichý souhlas, který legitimizoval to násilí jako výraz národní očisty, ale zároveň se přímo vlastně tohohle aktu opět neúčastní. Místní funkcionáři chápali tento krok jako jakýsi symbolický akt, jako ukázku jako projev české moci, která samostatně tedy řeší svoje vlastní záležitosti. Podobný vývoj můžeme vysledovat i v oblasti severovýchodních Čech, stejně jako na severní Moravě. V těchto oblastech se situace zhoršovala zejména jakýmsi mocenským vákuem nebo chaosem, který panoval v takzvaných znovu získaných územích, tedy v oblastech bývalých říšských oblastech, které byly nově obsazovány polskou mocí a polskými jednotkami. Mocenské poměry tady v těchto částech českých zemích byly v té době značně nejasné, hranice byly velmi tekuté a jurisdikce byla v té době zcela rozvolněná. Sovětští vojáci například podnikali z polského území nájezdy do českého pohraničí, rabovali, unášeli osoby, dobytek, majetek a tak dál. A následně se stahovali zpět za tu nově vytyčovanou hranici. Tím se samozřejmě znemožnilo jakékoliv vyšetřování a zároveň i vyjednávání s příslušnými veliteli. Ta odpovědnost za tyhle činy se naprosto rozplývala, rozvolňovala v nějaké síti mimochodných pravomocí. Chaos tady v tomhletom prostoru připomínal situaci, kterou tedy pro polské území velmi výstižně popsal Marcin Zaremba ve své knize Velký strach. Byla to společnost, která se sice dočkala konce války, ale nikoliv ještě návratu pořádku, což můžeme do značné míry stáhnout i na ten prostor českého pohraničí. V českém pohraničí správa existovala do značné míry jen formálně, zatímco každodenní realitu určovaly různé ozbrojené skupiny, provizorní příkazy a nahodilá spojenectví, což víceméně lze vztáhnout na celé období od května až minimálně do začátku září 1945. V takovém prostředí se násilí samozřejmě stávalo nejen projevem bezmoci, ale i prostředkem přežití a prostředkem ukořistění ve vlastním zájmu. Tu situaci můžeme opět ilustrovat například i na Bruntálsku, kde se po odchodu německé správy nebo po suspendování německé správy vytvořilo výrazné mocenské vákuum, které začaly vyplňovat revoluční gardy, partizánské skupiny a menší sovětské jednotky. Sověti tady v tomhletom prostoru usilovali zejména o obnovení pořádku, o zajištění dopravních tras a Češi na druhé straně měli velký zájem na provedení čistek. Výsledkem byla potom v období července 1945 vlna víceméně svévolného násilí, která propojovala tady ten mocenský chaos, pomstu a nějaké osobní zájmy. Ten vztah mezi dvěma složkami ještě ne. Ten vztah mezi těma stranami nebo složkami, to znamená mezi českou a sovětskou, byl zde tedy spíše pragmatický. Teď. V této souvislosti nelze, nebo bych nerad přehlédl ani genderový rozměr toho poválečného násilí. V paměti se často, nebo v takových těch sdílených obrazech konce války se často opakuje představa, že většinu znásilnění spáchali sovětští vojáci. Když se podíváme blíže na ty konkrétní případy, tak nám to opět odkrývá obraz trošičku jiný, a to takový, že se jednalo zejména o činy českých ozbrojenců. To násilí mělo funkci jakési symbolické pomsty a obnovy mužské autority, která byla válkou a předcházejícím vývojem do značné míry narušená, nebo aspoň jako narušená byla, ji prožívali ti tehdejší aktéři. Sovětské velení na druhé straně znásilňování i rabování ve zjištěných případech velmi výrazně trestalo, zatímco české složky opět postupovaly víceméně svévolně. Přenášení odpovědnosti za tuhle vlnu znásilňování na Rusy nebo na sovětské jednotky opět odpovídalo spíše poválečné snaze se vyvinit, zbavit se viny za tyhle ty případy. Pokud bych to měl nějak už začít uzavírat, tak vlastně tyhle příklady ukazují, že to poválečné násilí jako takové nebylo nějakým importem ze Sovětského svazu, mělo naopak velmi výrazné domácí kořeny a vyrůstalo z předchozí zkušenosti okupace a z předchozí zkušenosti rozšiřování jakéhosi tekutého výjimečného stavu. Rudá armáda tady v téhleté situaci do značné míry v tom roce 1945 spolu vytvářela podmínky, ale rozhodně nevyvíjela nějaký nátlak nebo nezavdávala nějaký pokyn k tomuto násilí. V její součinnosti nebo netečnosti se české ozbrojené složky a civilní správa rozhodly uplatňovat moc mimo právní rámec, aniž by v tom do značné míry viděli nějaký rozpor s tím ideálem osvobození. Zároveň mám pocit, že je důležité připomenout, že ta sovětská přítomnost na našem území měla jenom omezené trvání. Většina jednotek odešla již v průběhu léta na podzim 1945 a poslední oddíly se potom stahovaly do konce roku 1945. Většinou se už potom jednalo jenom o menší skupiny technického a dopravního zabezpečení, jež zajišťovaly víceméně odvoz vojenské techniky a válečné kořisti. V době, kdy se následně začal formovat poválečný československý režim, nebo kdy se politická moc přesouvala jaksi symbolicky směrem k Moskvě, tak už Rudá armáda na československém území víceméně nepůsobila. Ačkoliv je z dnešní perspektivy lákavé srovnávat rok 1945 s pozdějšími fázemi sovětského vlivu a mluvit o dvojí okupaci, tak tehdejší skutečnost byla výrazně odlišná. Lidé, kteří konec války prožili, tak považovali příchod Rudé armády za vysvobození. A jejich svědectví často mluví o úlevě, o pocitu jakéhosi oživení a o naději, která s tímhle událostí byla spojená. To, že zároveň pokračovalo násilí, na tom víceméně nic nezměnilo, spíše to vypovídá o tom, jak hluboké stopy ta válečná zkušenost zanechala v samotné české společnosti. Označovat květen 1945 za okupaci podle mě znamená podřizovat minulost logice pozdějšího vývoje a vytrhnout ji z historických souvislostí. Samozřejmě, že Rudá armáda zde prosazovala svoje zájmy, ale nevybudovala nějaký systém trvalé vojenské kontroly. Naopak odešla v řádu měsíců a následně následná politická závislost se vyvíjela až v důsledku samostatného domácího vývoje a v rámci tedy ustavování studené války. Zaměňovat dnes tehdejší osvobození za pozdější okupaci znamená zejména zbavovat se zodpovědnosti za tehdejší vývoj. Rok 1945 podle mě jako okupace neobstojí. Jednalo se o nejednoznačný přechod mezi válkou a mírem, ale na druhou stranu se česká společnost tehdy zbavila líha německé okupace. Nicméně rámec války ještě dlouho určoval pravidla jejího jednání. Rozostřovala se hranice práva a bezpráví v podmínkách, v němž tedy ten tekutý výjimečný stav nadále určoval běžné způsoby vládnutí. Podle mě dnes, když bychom mluvili o roku 1945 jako o osvobození, tak to neznamená, že bychom popírali jakékoliv poválečné bezpráví, ale spíš, že jsme ochotní ten tehdejší vývoj vnímat v jeho původní celistvosti. Rudá armáda ukončila válku, československý stát obnovoval svoji moc a právě jeho ozbrojené složky často opakovaly naučené vzorce násilí. Rok 1945 tedy dává daleko větší smysl jako osvobození, jako nedokonalé, zmatené, bolestné, ale přesto v té době vítané. V ní dává smysl jako okamžik, kdy se v hodině mezi psem a vlkem společnost znovu nadechla ke svobodě. A pokud se nám ta podoba té tehdejší svobody dnes nelíbí, tak by to nemělo být pro nás důvod k hledání dalších výmluv, nýbrž spíš důvod k hledání příčin toho, proč se to tehdy vyvíjelo, tak jak se to vyvíjelo. Děkuji za pozornost.
Okay, Justina, maybe you can follow with your presentation.
First of all, thank you to the organizers for having me today. I am delighted to be a part of this panel. My presentation today focuses on memories of the Second World War in the Baltic States, from the Soviet period to 1990 and afterwards. As its title suggests, it looks at several things: the so-called patriotic history, the decolonial approach, and memorial conflicts in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. First, I will give a brief overview of the historical background of the war, the Holocaust, wartime and post-war violence in the Baltic states, and then I will move on to different interpretations of the past. Since my research on war and post-war violence focuses mostly on Lithuania, there will be somewhat more examples from Lithuania than from the two other Baltic states. In July 1944, during the Vilnius offensive, Soviet writer Ilya Ehrenburg, who witnessed the widespread destruction of Belarusian cities as he advanced with the Red Army toward the Baltic states, noted with a certain astonishment that in Vilnius, and I quote him, the Germans had not had time to set fire to the town, and it was extraordinary to see the houses, Baroque Catholic churches, narrow old streets. End of quote. On the slide, you can see some shots from a Soviet footage dating July 1944, which shows a relatively undamaged city from urban fighting. Although Vilnius was spared total destruction in the summer of 1944, the city, and indeed the entire country, hardly resembled itself. The human devastation was palpable, radically transforming the country's ethnic and social composition. The 4 years of war, so from June 1941 to the summer of 1944, were marked by multiple forms of violence, and foremost of them the Holocaust. In Lithuania, by the end of the war, there were barely more than 20,000 Jewish survivors left. This amounts for less than 10% of the pre-war population. In Latvia, out of 85,000 Latvian Jews before the war, about 15,000 managed to retreat with the Red Army, but the survival rate of those who remained in the occupied country was very low, just about 2%. Estonia, on the other hand, had the smallest Jewish population of the three Baltic states, about 4,500 individuals, and most of them managed to retreat to the Soviet rear in the beginning of the war. Other victim groups in the Baltic states included the Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and non-Jewish civilians who were executed mostly in collective punitive actions or for resistance activities. According to current estimates, a total of about 100,000 individuals were murdered in the Baltic states during the 4 years of the German occupation. When the Red Army reconquered the Baltic territories in the summer of 1944, a large portion of the local population perceived the Soviet return as a second Soviet occupation. The Soviet takeover in the summer of 1944 went hand in hand with the emergence of armed anti-Soviet resistance, which is known in historiography as Forest Brothers. This prolonged conflict between the Baltic guerrillas and the Soviet state lasted well into the late 1940s and in some regions even into the early 1950s. The Soviet authorities repressed entire families of rebels, whom the Soviet state referred to as bandits. Therefore, families of anti-Soviet guerrillas were among the main groups of people who were deported to special settlement camps or gulag camps in Siberia. From 1940 to 1953, about 1,300 people were deported from Lithuania, 60,000 from Latvia, and about 35,000 from Estonia. These numbers make the Baltic states not only sites of some of the most extensive mass violence during the war, but also among the most significant sites of forced migration during and after the war. However, migration in the Baltic states at the end of the war was not only forced, but in some cases voluntary. In the summer of 1944, thousands of Baltic refugees left together with the retreating German forces. This heterogeneous group included former German collaborators, people who had experienced Stalinist repressions and feared the return of the Red Army, as well as members of various anti-Soviet groups. By 1946, Baltic populations made up about 20% of some 850,000 individuals in displaced persons camps in the Western occupation zones of post-war Germany. Most of them later emigrated to the United States. In the post-war period, those Baltic emigres became some of the most vocal anti-communist voices in the West, especially in the United States. The ideological competition of the Cold War provided a sort of favorable context for their political engagement. Their post-war memoirs and other publications in exile tend to emphasize what they call their double resistance to the Nazis and to the Soviets. In the Cold War setting, former German collaborators often reframed their wartime roles in more acceptable narratives of resistance to Bolshevism. At the same time, Baltic emigres in the West aligned themselves with post-war international order and the emerging human rights discourse. As early as the 1940s, Emigre publications used the term genocide to describe the Stalinist deportations of Baltic peoples and the post-war repression of anti-Soviet guerrillas. In the 1990s, Lithuania adopted this legal definition of Stalinist crimes as genocide. This move became instrumental in prosecuting individuals in the 1990s and in the 2000s who were involved in deportations and anti-guerrilla repression. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, in the Baltic states under Soviet rule, the very first initiatives to commemorate the victims of Nazi violence and the Holocaust were carried out by survivors and local communities. Unfortunately, there are very few images available of the first memorials built in the very early years of the post-war period. Many of them were made of wood and inspired by vernacular culture, sometimes even by Christian symbolism. For example, at the site of the Pirčiupiai massacre in Lithuania, in which German forces burned the village and killed 119 inhabitants in July 1944, survivors and local inhabitants erected wooden crosses to commemorate the victims, and that was in 1947. Later, wooden crosses were removed by the Soviet authorities to build a large commemorative stone and a monumental sculpture known as Mother of Pirčiupiai that you can see here on the slide. Mother of Pirčiupiai is one of many pieces of Soviet monumental art erected in the Baltic states during this period of late 1950s, early 1960s. This period was a kind of Soviet memory boom, with the emergence of monumental statues marking sites of mass violence and the establishment of several major memorial museums. The Ninth Port Museum in Kaunas, featuring a monumental sculpture and a modern museum building, is another good example from this period. And you can see here some early photographs of the site and a photograph also from the opening of the museum in 1959. Moreover, some of the most prominent examples of Soviet memorial art were also erected in the late 1950s and 1960s. The Salaspils Camp Memorial that you can see here is a good example from this period. It is one of the largest memorials in Europe and an illustrative example of brutalist architecture from the late 1960s. In the Baltic states under Soviet rule, public art was taken seriously. Public sculptures were understood as political actors that not only reflect current politics, but also shape them. This understanding, one can argue, goes back to 1918, when the Soviet government adopted the decree on the monuments of the Republic, which defined public sculpture as a medium of political communication. The independence of the three Baltic states in 1990 was meant to mark a clear rupture with the past. As historian James Mark has argued, when early efforts to achieve judicial justice against former communists failed, the Soviet regime was instead put on so-called cultural trial. In this cultural trial, their interpretation of the past took place through the creation of new museums, new forms of remembrance, and the decommunization of public spaces. Streets were cleared of communist references, and many Soviet monuments were demolished. In Lithuania, most of these pieces of Soviet public art are now preserved in the Grutas Park Museum, which was established by a private initiative in 2001. Today, the museum holds more than 80 pieces of Soviet monumental art, including statues of Lenin and Stalin that once dominated the urban landscapes in the Baltic states. You can see a few examples of the museum's holdings on the slide. The sculpture between Lenin and Stalin, the young lady, represents Maria Melnikaite, a Soviet partisan who was killed by the Nazis and who was one of the very few Lithuanians to receive the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Since the independence of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the dominant historical narrative about the past can be described, according to Lithuanian historian Violeta Davoliūtė, as the Baltic model of civic patriotic history. Former political prisoners and deportees became some of the most influential memory agents in shaping this patriotic history. Historians, too, were among the most active mnemonic agents in the Baltic states after 1990. They formed an interpretative elite that played a key role in how the past was presented, remembered, and commemorated. In fact, in the early 1990s, historians' strong involvement in political life was so remarkable in Estonia that the country was even called a republic of historians. The 1990s were also marked by the creation of historical commissions that investigated the crimes committed on the Baltic soil by both the German and Soviet occupation regimes. This sort of memorial boom of the 1990s reflected the Baltic countries' renewed interest in long silenced memories of Stalinist crimes and the construction of what historian James Wercht calls a usable past, a past that emphasized the suffering endured under Soviet occupation and often mythologized post-World War II anti-Soviet resistance. From the early 1990s to today, the Baltic states have frequently been criticized, and often rightly so, for privileging narratives of Stalinist crimes, while, on the other hand, downplaying the Holocaust. Many observers have approached dominant narratives about the past in the Baltic states in terms of memorial conflict, or framed them as a Gulag versus the Holocaust opposition. Some of the main moments of such memory wars were the legal adoption of the term genocide to describe Soviet deportations and repressions against the Forest Brothers, investigations into Holocaust survivors for alleged war crimes in Lithuania, and annual public commemorations of former Waffen-SS Legion members in Latvia and Estonia. However, some gradual changes in official memory politics in the Baltic states came in the late 2000s, 2010s. The focus on Soviet crimes did not fade, but the dominant memorial culture became somehow more inclusive of Holocaust remembrance. These changes went hand in hand with the Baltic states' entrance into NATO and the European Union, the process that Baltic populations perceived as their return to Europe. In 2009, the European Parliament adopted the Resolution on European Conscience and Totalitarianism, therefore integrating the memory of Stalinist repressions, what Estonian scholar Maria Malkso called Europe's subaltern past, into a shared European framework of remembrance. Since then, Official Baltic national memorial cultures have largely focused on this narrative of two totalitarian regimes and their crimes. However, since the 1990s, different communities in the Baltic states have established alternative memories of the past. For example, the most radical memory agents, such as far-right groups, not only deny collaboration of their nationals with the Nazis during the war, but also celebrate interwar anti-Semitism. For instance, the Lithuanian far-right party, Nacionalinis susivienijimas, which can be translated as National Rally, ran in the 2019 European elections with the slogan, "Raise your head, Lithuanian." This phrase references the title of an anti-Semitic pamphlet published in 1933 by Jonas Noreika, who was a Nazi collaborator during the war and who later joined anti-Soviet resistance after the war. Alternative personal and collective memories of the past also exist among minority populations and certain social groups in the Baltic states. To date, most research has focused on Russian speakers in Latvia and Estonia, who often have positive memories of the Soviet past that diverge from the current dominant national narrative in the two countries. Anthropologist Neringa Klumbite, for her part, has examined nostalgia for the Soviet past among newly marginalized communities in Lithuania, mainly rural populations living in economic insecurity, whose memories of the good Soviet times stand in sharp contrast to the dominant narrative portraying state socialism as a criminal past. Such positive memories of the Soviet times are currently stigmatized in the Baltic states because they are usually perceived as denying or downplaying Stalinist crimes. One of the problems with this stigmatization of alternative memories of the Soviet past is that the current memory canon is not elastic enough to include non-imperialistic narratives about the past. These are different from, for example, discourses about Great Russia, often found among some Russian-speaking communities in the Baltics. The Roma populations are a very good example. It is difficult for Baltic Roma to find their place within the dominant post-1990 Baltic narratives about the Second World War. This situation is further reinforced by the continued marginalization of Roma populations after 1990. Secondly, a recent memorial trope of the Holocaust in the Baltics, especially in Lithuania, commemorates the Holocaust as part of the wider history of Jewish life in the region. The catastrophe of Lithuanian Jewry is often portrayed in museums, literature, and public discussions as a sort of violent end of a flourishing pre-war community of renowned poets, artists, and Yiddish institutions. This pre-war cultural vibrancy symbolizes a positive memory of peaceful coexistence before the war and aligns to a certain degree with a rather idealized view of interwar Lithuania in the collective national memory. This sort of nostalgia for the lost pre-war world stands in contrast to the lived reality of pre-war Roma populations, for instance, who were already marginalized before the war and whose marginalization continued throughout the Soviet era and after 1990. The Russian war in Ukraine has brought back with renewed intensity the question of sovereign uncertainty and national security concerns in the Baltic states. Lithuanian-American political scientist Dovilė Budrytė and Estonian researcher Marija Malkso have recently argued that in being vocal supporters of Ukraine, the Baltic states have also somehow negotiated the historically marginalized status within Europe, asserted their agency, and pursued a transformation from policy takers to policy makers. In the three Baltic states, the war and this so-called decolonial movement, as many observers have called it, has also drawn the attention of scholars and the general public to issues of Soviet and now Russian imperialism and decolonization in Eastern Europe. But is there anything fundamentally new in the field of public memory in the Baltic states since this decolonial movement of 2022? Firstly, the post-colonial perspective in the Baltic states is not entirely new. The first publications treating decades of Soviet rule as a colonial experience date back as early as 1990s. However, in the last decades, dominant interpretations of the past have focused instead on the Baltic states' successful return to Europe and on the narrative of two totalitarian regimes. Positioning themselves as peoples who experienced colonization seemed somehow unsuitable for Baltic populations who insisted on their belonging to the Western world and opted for voluntary Westernization. Post-2022 developments in memory politics are still too recent to fully assess the impact of this decolonial moment on the future of Baltic memory cultures. For example, the new wave of demolitions of Soviet-era monuments since 2022, such as the Soviet tank in Narva in Estonia that you can see on the slide, seems more as a continuation of earlier efforts to cleanse public spaces of Soviet monuments than something entirely new. Yet, despite the focus of the 1990s patriotic history and the more recent decolonial approach on Stalinist crimes and criminalization of the Soviet rule, important differences remain between the two interpretations of the past or two perspectives. I would argue that, at least theoretically, a postcolonial perspective understood as an approach that listens to subaltern voices offers a framework to address the memories of marginalized groups, such as the Roma in the Baltic states. Postcolonial studies may also open space for transnational comparisons of imperial and colonial histories. This would mean that instead of focusing solely on relations between Western and Eastern Europe, postcolonial studies invite to think about connections between Eastern Europe and Global South. This geographical shift, as Ukrainian scholar Tamara Hundarova has argued, could help bring together the voices of the second and third worlds. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I thank you so much, Justina and Borbala and Jaromír, for joining us today in this discussion. And I hope we are going to continue some other time because I think there's plenty more to discuss. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.